Thank you very much, Federico, for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to be here tonight. I must, however, really start by saying that when I took this on, I had very little idea of what a daunting task it is to talk about the imagination, a very vast topic. So I need to warn you that I will not be able to cover much territory, and also that my knowledge of discourse on the imagination is largely derived from literature and literary theory. I will be very selective in my presentation, and I will be presenting to you some thoughts that will hopefully enable us to imagine or reimagine the role of the imagination in the academy and in those disciplines in which the concept of the imagination would seem to have an important place. And by that I mean, above all, the arts and literature. These disciplines are not dedicated only to analysis and understanding of cultural objects, but also to the making of such objects. And they have, unfortunately, been marginalized as decoration, entertainment, or as a contribution to social cohesion or nation building by some developments in our country over recent decades, into which I will not go into in detail. The decision by the faculty tonight to make the imagination part of its deliberations, and interestingly, it's the first topic, is an interesting and bold one. It also is appropriate. Through large parts of at least Western history, our object of study, and I want you to understand simply under that a piece of art, has been seen as a product of the imagination, whether that be in daily language or in more learned discourse. If we accept this fact, and we can hardly reject it, we should also accept that our scholarly discourse needs to account for the role of the imagination in some way. Research and scholarship focusing solely on a description of artworks is likely to lead to an impoverishment, not least because it will not be able to escape relying on unexamined assumptions about creative processes. Moreover, we need to keep asking ourselves whether the language we use for talking about art is adequate to the complex existence of cultural objects in the world. The imagination as a major critical concept made its full entry into Western discourse only with the advent of Romanticism towards the end of the 18th century. Yes. So I will focus on that moment for a while. And I don't mean to imply that there had been no reflections on the imagination before then. There were many. Indeed, perhaps the most justly famous exposition on the powers of the imagination, and I thank my friend and colleague Sarah Roberts for reminding me of this, comes from Theseus in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. I quote, "The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. One sees more devils than vast hell can hold. That is the madman. The lover, all as frantic, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. The poet's eye, in a fine frenzy, rolling, doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and, as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shape and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name." We note, perhaps with some concern, that the domain of the poet or artist is depicted as similar to that of the lover and the madman. He or she distinguishes herself from these other frenzied creatures, however, by the ability to give shape to devils and beauty and so forth, to transform airy nothing into a local habitation and a name. Philosophers, and I've looked quite extensively at what they say, don't have much to offer on this topic because they often approach the imagination purely as the ability to form mental pictures in the mind. Following Theseus, we can say that it is the additional ability to embody such pictures in concrete artifacts that is at stake in our conversation tonight. And of course, how to understand that. I will not focus on Romanticism in its totality for obvious reasons, nor on its later developments, which some may call perversions, such as aestheticism, the La Poula movement, or the decadent celebration of sensual experience in authors like Huysmans and Pater. Instead, my emphasis in the first part of what I'm saying tonight will be on the expansive and unifying claims made for the imagination by its early proponents. I mean the early proponents of Romanticism. Of interest here are therefore primarily the brothers Schlegel, August Wilhelm, and Friedrich, and in England, Coleridge and Shelley. The people most articulately and most dramatically spoke about the powers of the imagination. We will take our cue from them. But before looking into some of these texts, a brief overview of dominant views and discourses about the creative arts up to that point may be necessary. In their views on art, Plato and Aristotle, the pillars of Western philosophy, provide little explicit space for the imagination as a force independent of others, although there may be some implicit space. I'll get to that. Halliwell argues that already in ancient Greece there was an understanding of mimesis, that classical term, that does not differ that substantially from the making of art more generally. In the Republic, Plato sees the artist as an imitator, as someone who produces a copy of objects in the real world, which by themselves have no independent existence, but are secondary manifestations of the world of ideas, which in his worldview is the real. This, admittedly simplistic view, has formed the basis for the allegation that Plato is hostile to the arts. But Halliwell, amongst others, argues that he does provide, in other texts, a certain autonomy to the made object, an ontological status that's not simply derived from it being a reflection of something else. As Halliwell also shows, discussions of mimesis have from the earliest times displayed tension between seeing the artwork as a reflection of the world, or on the other as a construction of a, or possibly the world. Whatever the case may be, it seems clear also that Plato is afraid of the uncontrollable forces that may be unleashed by what one might call the powers of the imagination, and that kind of fear has reverberated through centuries up to the present moment. Think of what happened to those pop singers in Moscow, for example. Being both an idealist and a moralist, Plato was acutely aware of the disruptive potential of art to encourage desires and emotions that would be hard to accommodate within his strictly controlled polity. It may be said, and I'm making statements here that I would have to defend if I ever wrote them down, may be said with perhaps a measure of generosity that Aristotle's implicit rebuttal of Plato in his Ars Poetica allowed the entry of the concept of the imagination into literary discourse, and by extension, artistic discourse more generally. One can signal two noticeable shifts. First, compared to Plato, Aristotle decisively replaces the idea of imitative art with that of making. Writing a tragedy becomes the skillful construction of a thing with a beginning, a middle, and an end, not dependent on the shape, on something outside of it. Second, he releases the poet from the obligation to be true to historical facts, thereby allowing the invention of what would later be called fiction in the interest of presenting a convincing and persuasive series of actions. Thus, the artist is, I think, quite considerably liberated from Plato's relatively static model. Mimesis remained the guiding principle of artistic theory for 2 millennia, even though M.H. Abrams, in his famous book, The Mirror and the Lamp, is able to show that much later theory, influenced by the principles of rhetoric, devoted significant attention to the desired effect on the audience, which was almost always a mixture of pleasure and learning. The authority of Plato and Aristotle was such that later writings often ended up reinterpreting or even distorting the 2 Greek masters. I don't know who it was who said that all of philosophy is a series of footnotes to Aristotle and Plato. In at least literary theory, there is a great deal of truth in that. Around the object of artistic activity, of mimesis, for example, the view gradually took hold that the artist presents to us not the world as it exists in its brokenness, sinfulness, and sordidness, but a better, a more ideal world of which we are persuaded through the mastery of the poet or artist. Another development, less fortunate, maybe even less fortunate, was the tendency to recommend the imitation of classical sources as a kind of shortcut to the imitation or the depiction of reality itself. Up to the end of the 17th century, 18th, yes, one may on occasion come across the notion that art arises out of inspiration from an external source. This does resemble what Theseus says about the poet, who, unlike the madman and the lover, is able to give shape and form to the frenzy that overcomes him. But in order to show just how radically the early Romantics repudiated not only this idea, but the fundamental premises of all thinking about art and literature before them, let me quote from Friedrich Schlegel. This is his famous 116th Athenaeum fragment. My translation: Romantic poetry is progressive, universal poetry. Think, for the sake of our conversation, of the possibility of also thinking about art in that way. Romantic poetry is progressive, universal poetry. It alone is infinite, as it alone is free, recognizing as its only law that the freedom of the poet does not subject itself to any law. The force of the fragment derives from the fact that it does not offer to present an argument. It is not an overtly polemical statement simply because it asserts what is regarded as evident. It is impossible, within the context of a lecture such as this, to deal with all the ramifications of Schlegel's statements, and there are quite a few more. And I will therefore limit myself to outlining the main convictions captured by it. And I'm actually going to argue that a lot of this has survived in our present thinking about literature and the arts, even though we may no longer live in 1798. The journal Athenaeum marks the shift in Western discourse on the arts from mimesis to expression. Early Romantic thinking boldly challenges the critical notion that art arises in the first instance from an attempt to depict, present, represent something in the world, which, as Hallowell argues, was in fact sometimes a reduction of the complexity and nuance of Greek thought. Such depictions of the world will of course still happen, but the origin and the core of artistic endeavor is here located somewhere else, inside the poet or the artist. Such thinking is obviously related to the idealism of the moment. Comes as no surprise, for example, to hear or read that the Schlegels had a very high regard for the philosopher Fichte. Secondly, Schlegel recognizes no boundaries at all in claiming freedom for the individual spirit expressing itself in art. He uses the German word Willkür, not Freiheit. And it's notable because that word denotates an unqualified faith in forces generated from inside the individual that goes much beyond what we would normally understand under the concept of freedom. In the way my German dictionary defines it, synonyms like arbitrariness, capriciousness, high-handedness, even despotism come to mind. Thirdly, the imagination is seen as a universal, connecting and unifying force. Not necessarily it's in that progressive, universal poesy. So it's progressive in its incorporation of everything in the world, all layers, all contradictions, etc. And it moves towards that goal all the time. The freedom with which it ranges over phenomena means that it is not tied to the discrete existence of whatever it may choose to express. Fourthly, I'll just mention this because I'll come back to it briefly. There is a very strong metaphysical basis in this kind of thinking, because art, literature also combines the particular with the universal, the temporary with the eternal. In the English world, perhaps the most radical and celebratory articulation of early romantic notions can be found in Shelley's A Defense of Poetry, less learned than Coleridge, but more exuberant. As a poet, Shelley is partial to the word, but it would commit no violence to his views to state that much of what he says can be seen as pertinent to other art forms, if allowance is made for the age-old conviction that there is an equivalence between the visual and the verbal domains. Indeed, Shelley himself seems to lend support to such an extension of his views at the end of his essay, where he says that, quote, "What is called poetry, in a restricted sense, has a common source with all other forms of order and beauty, according to which the materials of human life are susceptible of being arranged, and which is poetry in a universal sense." Now I therefore, and I will do it, I think it's justified to treat poetry and imagination as more or less coterminous in Shelley's argument. The Defense of Poetry is not a logical treatise. Almost by definition it could not be. But I'll highlight a few central elements of the essay. Shelley distinguishes two classes of mental action, reason and imagination. Reason, he says, is the mind, quote, contemplating the relations borne by one thought to another, end quote. Imagination is the mind, quote, acting upon those thoughts to color them with its own light and composing from them, as from elements, other thoughts, each containing within itself the principle of its own integrity, end quote. Reason, he says, is the enumeration of qualities already known. Imagination, on the other hand, is the perception of the value of those qualities. All of this still seems fairly modest, implying that the imagination is a qualitative engagement with thought, seeking out relations between thoughts, individualizing them, bestowing value on them. But Shelley makes claims that extend far beyond this apparently secondary role. Like Schlegel, he identifies the imagination with the origin of man, something at the root of human development and civilization. He uses the simile of man as an Aeolian lyre over which, quote, a series of external and internal impressions are driven. The imagination does not simply produce melody in response to those impressions or stimuli. It produces harmony, quote, by an internal adjustment of the sounds or motions. It could be said that the defense of poetry is ultimately driven by a desire for universal harmony between what Shelley calls existence, perception, and expression, between the world, which offers to us a diversity of sensual data, our experience of that world, and thirdly, the way in which that experience is symbolically expressed in products of the imagination. The imagination, therefore, is a unifying force which, through its expressions, makes the true and the good apprehensible. Through the combinatory power of metaphor, quote, it marks the before unapprehended relations of things and perpetuates their apprehension. There clearly is a strong metaphysical and Platonic strand in this thinking. I wish to draw attention to the repeated use of the term unapprehended, which indicates that there are insights, according to Shelley, and experiences that would remain outside our grasp if we relied only on the power of reason. There is, however, enough evidence to go even further than that and state that for Shelley, the imagination is the central unifying and ordering principle of life and the universe, although it is not very clear whether that order is discovered or imagined. The phrase, quote, those who imagine and express this indestructible order, end quote, is certainly not unambiguous. It is possible to find in Shelley's treatise some knee-jerk expressions of romantic and older thought. Poetry is ever accompanied with pleasure. He was almost bound to say that given the history he was in. Another quote, the poet is a nightingale who sits in darkness and sings to cheer its own solitude with sweet sounds. Shame appears to reduce the imagination to a form of personal consolation in what's almost a prefiguring of later and more solipsistic attitudes towards aesthetics. Of greater interest for our discussion tonight is the more strident pronouncements, according to which the imagination is both a confident intervention and a productive force in human affairs. Shelley answers the familiar objection to the immorality of poetry, how old is that, by stating that this is based on, quote, a misconception of the manner in which poetry, art, acts to produce the moral improvement of man, end quote. Effectively, he ascribes a secondary role to ethics by saying that, quote, ethical science arranges the elements which poetry has created, which the imagination has created. According to this view, ethics is the organization into moral schemata of the new thoughts and combinations of thoughts and of new human possibilities that are opened up by the imagination. It is notable that these possibilities are strongly associated with a kind of universal human solidarity. I quote, a man to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. The paragraph I'm quoting for is interesting in that it refers to the imagination as the embodiment of beauty, or sometimes the revelation of hidden beauty. Never quite sure whether that beauty is a given which is revealed or something that is created by the imagination. Kind of ambivalence in that whole piece. Also says the imagination is a source of pleasure. only to make these elements, beauty and pleasure, ultimately subservient to the all-encompassing moral purpose of the imagination, which could be defined, my terms, as the opening up of the mind to hitherto unperceived connections between things and thoughts. This central moral thrust and total faith in the powers of the imagination will be very clear from the concluding sentences, and I don't know how one pronounces them without, well, poets, Shelley says, are the hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they understand not, the trumpets which sign to battle and feel not what they inspire, the influence which moves not but is moved. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. End quote. I wanted to go to Schlegel and Shelley, because in considering the imagination, I think it's useful to be reminded of just how uncompromisingly radical these statements are. And I would like to call them, in a sense, foundational statements. Because even though we are unlikely to share these authors' philosophical idealism, their ideas have become deeply embedded in our thinking about literature and art, maybe in a more modest form. The notion that in literature and art we encounter startlingly new and surprising perspectives on the world, that literature and art rely on revelation, demonstration, rather than explication, that the boundaries of discrete disciplinary inquiry are transgressed joyfully in literature and art, and that literature and art can transform the way we think about the world, are all ultimately derived from this major shift in Western thinking about these matters. Brief digression. From the perspective of considering the position of literature and art in the academy, I think it must be said that the Schlegel's more adventurous thoughts had difficulty gaining access to the ivory tower. This is because the idea that scientific and scholarly activity essentially is the empirical gathering of evidence leading to the formulation of rules, positivism, in other words, played such a dominant role in 19th century scholarship. In the case of literary studies and artistic studies too, this essentially meant trying to explain the work with reference not to the imagination, but to determining elements in the background, personal makeup, and social circumstances of the author. Race, milieu, et moment, to quote Taine, or, to formulate it a little bit differently, the role of inheritance, genetic and otherwise, of the physical and social environment, and what people like Rudolf Unger, following Hegel, called the Zeitgeist. At the risk of riding roughshod over huge complexity, it seems also fair to say that late Romantic thinking tended to be a retreat from the world into a space of aesthetic pleasure and sometimes hermetic and aristocratic contemplation. Beauty in decadent literature, think of Walter Pater, for example, and symbolism is less a form of social engagement than a refuge against the world in which the sense of human mortality is countered by a savouring of the intense sensual and intellectual pleasures of the moment. Thus, in the 19th century, a rift started developing between theories about the imagination and social science-oriented explanatory models, which enjoyed great prestige. It was only with Wilhelm Dilthey that a concerted attempt was made to demarcate for the historical and cultural sciences, those sciences, in other words, dealing with unique events or phenomena, a different method based on Einfühlung or intuition, sympathetic engagement, and Verstehen, understanding, rather than Erklärung or explanation, formulation into rule-bound knowledge. According to Dilthey, there could not be a set of laws determining how the work of art came about. Instead, as a unique historical phenomenon, the work of art requires from us meticulous attention to its own existence. Thus, the origin, in fact, of that difference between the Naturwissenschaften and the Geisteswissenschaften, the sciences and the humanities, a 19th century invention. Now I want to jump and say, well, we've spoken about the imagination, we've spoken about the fact that thinking about the imagination in a productive way was not always that easy to accommodate within those paradigms of what knowledge and scholarly enterprise should be. Could say more about that, but let me jump to perhaps the most important 20th century attempt, very illuminating attempt to bridge the gap between the natural and cultural sciences, which was launched by Ernst Cassirer, who spent the later years of his career developing his philosophy of cultural forms. He questions, and this is quite something, the widespread and fundamental belief that the natural sciences have a stronger basis in evidence, a stronger evidentiary base than the cultural sciences. That's quite startling because I think most of us would be inclined to share the intuitive belief that the natural sciences are able to claim a greater exactitude and reliability in their method and their outcome. No, says Cassirer, and in his book, The Logic of the Humanities, he sets out to argue that the two methods identified by Dilthey, two cultures in C.P. Snow's famous formulation, are in fact not that far apart and are on important levels the same thing. It's therefore worthwhile offering a brief summary of Cassirer's arguments. The natural sciences, he says, work with the perception of things, objects, natural phenomena, i.e., concrete phenomena in the world, as well as with the idea that our thinking and language are able to represent those things with precision. Darstellen is his word. In contrast to this, the cultural sciences work with what he calls the perception of expression, i.e., the perception of phenomena that do not belong to the natural world, but have been produced by human beings within a cultural context. These phenomena are not natural objects, obviously. They are cultural objects requiring a reception by an audience, a reader, a viewer, in order to assume meaning. Crucially, Cassirer argues that neither form, concrete form of things in the world, nor perception can be reduced to each other, or one to the other, because they both are primary phenomena, Urphänomene. They also can, therefore, not be an epistemological hierarchy. It's nonsense, he says, to give preference to the perception of things above the perception of cultural objects. He's our greatest friend amongst the philosophers. Whereas the natural sciences find their evidential base by appealing to the perception of things in the world, he says, producing truth claims, hypotheses, about states of affairs in the natural world that can be tested against the evidence or in terms of their explanatory power. The cultural sciences take their evidence from the sphere of expressive perception. What does that mean? It means that our evidence is derived from our fundamental experience of other human beings as fellow selves who share with us an intersubjective world of cultural meanings and who are, like us themselves, producers of cultural objects and meanings. And Cassira's point is really important. He says that is as valid and as solid an enterprise as anything happening in the so-called natural sciences. Here we see the outlines of Cassira's answer to the old dilemma of the uniqueness of the cultural object, which in the tradition of hermeneutics has led to the design of methods whose purpose ultimately was the reconstruction of that moment, that present of origin in which the individual imagination went into a fantastic alliance with the language of literature or art. Cassira recognizes the obvious fact that each painting or piece of music has its individual place in a particular historical time or geographical and cultural social space. But as it enters the world of cultural exchange, it also enters a space in which it will continuously, but never finally, be interpreted and reinterpreted. Out of this arises the possibility of a cultural meaning that may perhaps not be universal, as Cassira sometimes really wishes it to be, I think, but which may assume a great measure of stability over time and across space. He says that the meaning emerges asymptotically, those lines that move ever closer, never to touch, asymptotically, as it were, as the never to be completed limit of a sequence of interpretation and reinterpretation. Wish to say two more things about Cassira. First, his thinking implies that the natural sciences cannot avoid the sphere of perception or symbolic form. They do not simply operate in the world of things and of natural forms. The natural and cultural sciences have in common the fundamental characteristic that they are involved in a continuous and never fully to be completed process of historical and philosophical interpretation and inquiry. Cassira puts forward, therefore, a synthesis of all human endeavor in the field of knowledge in his particular understanding of objectivity, which I would like to call the objectivity of process, of scholarly process. To this, one might add that natural science, since Cassira, has moved into territory where it can hardly sustain the experimentally based truth claims that are traditionally associated with it. Some theories about the origin of the universe, for example, make Shelley's flights of the imagination appear quite modest. Secondly, an objection to Cassira's understanding of the cultural sciences may be, probably is, that it ignores or underplays cultural specificity. Is it feasible, for example, to imagine or assume that Rembrandt's The Night Watch can, through a process of interpretation, reinterpretation, by various people from various places at different times, assume a meaning that releases it from its particular origin, that might even be called universal? Is that feasible? It is here that Cassira may be open to the objection that his work takes a Western framework of discourse too much for granted. That, to use a very overworked term, it is Eurocentric. Against this, I wish to stress Cassira's acknowledgement that there is no limit and therefore no point of completion to the process of interpretation and meaning-making of products of the imagination. And more importantly, perhaps even than that, that process is in principle available and accessible to everybody. Implied in this thinking is that engagement with the meaning of cultural objects is guided by the attempt to create shared meaning and to overcome cultural divides. In this sense, his work is a strong counter to the later, and with respect, very Foucauldian belief that as individuals we are trapped within a particular cultural framework and the discursive power that defines it. I also just wish to stress the humanism of Caceres' thinking, which one may define as a refusal to accept that knowledge in the cultural sciences is inexact, arbitrary, and individualized, or that the limitations imposed by our own situation in space and time cannot be overcome by human debate. Considering these ideas, it's not difficult to see in them some elements, this is my final bit, which may be useful in thinking about the situation of the cultural sciences in the circumstances of South Africa today. We live in a country that could be described as a place of discontent and dissent, a place which still suffers the devastating consequences of centuries of repression and inequality, and which, it would appear, the idea of a common purpose or a unifying narrative is being demolished, to borrow a term from the South African Communist Party, by a pervasive factionalism. Not surprisingly, within this context, the meaning of art can be as contested, or even more so, than political or economic questions. One need only to refer to the furore around Brett Murray's The Spear, or to the Minister of Arts and Culture's, then Minister of Arts and Culture's, response to Sanella Nwali's erotic photographs of black female couples, to see not only wildly varying interpretations of individual artworks, but opposing, maybe even incompatible opinions on the function of the arts within the public domain. The easy and ultimately unproductive response to such apparent Philistinism is to be adversarial and dismissive. Such responses set up a hierarchy that I really think we should avoid. A hierarchy: I'm in the know, you are not. On a deeper level, I would argue it's necessary to insist and to defend that insistence that cultural products are a product of the imagination as well as a challenge to the imagination, and that keeping open the space for argument is always more important than winning. Caceres' idea, I want to bring it, sort of drag it in a little bit here, of the tragedy, calls it the tragedy of artistic endeavor, is based on the thought that no painting, no piece of music ever embodies the ambitions that may have been present in the mind of its maker. We always fall short. No serious artist could claim that his or her work is fully adequate to its intentions, whatever those may have been. Against this, however, stands a simple fact that provides more than feeble consolation. Once completed, the work is given to the world. Depending obviously on the importance that will get attached to it, it becomes part of that never-ending process, that never-ending history of interpretation, reinterpretation, evaluation, re-evaluation. It enters a domain of shared meaning to which we have to commit ourselves, where it has an afterlife that can extend far beyond the author's imaginings. As would have become clear in the early parts of this lecture, it's useful to be reminded of the expansive claims that have historically been made for the powers of the imagination. To hear those people who did not think about this in any modest way We do not need to fully endorse the thinking of high romanticism in order to recognize in the writings of Friedrich Schlegel and Shelley a refreshing adventurism and optimism. To embrace the world as large and not parochially defined, to think across boundaries, to imagine a different present and a different future, to see in literature and art a creative way of thinking more imaginatively about what is possible, these sentiments clearly inform their thinking and have not lost any of their relevance. In important ways, Paul Ricoeur's critical engagement with the tradition of hermeneutics can be embraced as a methodological accompaniment to Cassira's idea that the work of art is given to the world and posterity. Ricoeur's writings on phenomenology and hermeneutics can be summarized crassly by saying that he repudiates two ideas. The first is that it is the task of interpretation to reach or reconstruct the unique moment of making in which the individual genius or talent of the artist and the language of his or her medium came together. Quite apart from the fact that such reconstruction is in principle perhaps an impossible, well not, but it really is an impossible task. The whole point of producing a cultural object is that that object is released from its origins and becomes available for enjoyment and reception by others. The second idea repudiated by Ricoeur is that in engaging with art, I'm irretrievably locked into my own subjectivity. One of the less fortunate outcomes of reception studies is the idea that there will always be as many texts as there are readers, and thus that all readings are equally valid. That probably is true, but it is interesting only from the perspective of psychology. Ricoeur offers us the idea that by engaging with a work of art, I, together with others, engage with an invitation to imaginatively expand my own horizons by a confrontation with the possibilities my object of study presents to me. It is not in me or in the object of study that meaning resides. Instead, it comes into being in the dynamic space between me and the object. So finally, we could ask, is there a role for the imagination in the academy? Now, I've obviously not come here to say no. The answer has to be yes, but it fortunately also has to be said that we have often been too timid to provide that answer as assertively as we should or could. Let me highlight just a few aspects of that answer. Schlegel and Shelley remind us that the imagination, in its ability to combine thoughts from previously discrete spheres, to produce new thoughts and to cross boundaries, has the potential to expand the mind. In addition, in their early romantic idealism, they are not prepared to accept cultural boundaries that easily. It's from this time that the idea of world art, world literature comes. They believe in the capacity of the imagination to unite instead of to divide, unite in understanding, to create new areas of human interaction and comprehension. Cassira, on the other hand, reminds us that the sphere from which the cultural sciences derive their evidence is not reducible to the sphere of things. It cannot be made scientific, quote unquote, in the sense of the natural sciences, and nor should it be. From the beginning, the cultural sphere is what he calls the sphere of perception, in which objects of study already are bearers of social meaning and invite us to engage in meaning-making or interpretation. In addition, he puts the natural and cultural sciences on the same level as two approaches that will have a different methodological focus, but are ultimately connected by the common attempt to understand the world we live in through the production of symbolic forms. This means two things. First, the creative process and its outcomes cannot be absorbed into a supposedly scientific paradigm, research paradigm, that implies the importation of methods that are alien to it. Second, the world of the arts must resist any attempt to curtail its freedom by imposing on it the duty to serve any political or social agenda, no matter how worthy that agenda might otherwise be. This does not imply a withdrawal into the aesthetic domain. Instead, it implies the recognition that in the case of the arts, social engagement is of a different, imaginative nature, with no need to justify itself by appealing to methodologies that are at odds with the nature of the imaginative object. All of this, finally, imposes on us a not insignificant pedagogical challenge. The question is not whether students from government schools have a better training in the natural or the cultural science way of thinking. The question is whether they have been taught anything at all. If we truly believe in the power of the imagination, the core of the educational task is to equip our students with the tools to participate meaningfully and in the process of interpretation, the process of understanding of the symbolic forms that find their origin in that most elusive of concepts, the imagination. Thank you.